for Project Managers, Part 2, Implementation, with Yakub Suchi, who is the Senior Solutions Architect here at Acquia, and Heather James, who's the Manager of Learning Services here at Acquia. I just wanted to make a quick shout out to Dinesh, who actually contacted me over Twitter some months ago and actually recommended that we do this material online and make it available. So, hello, Dinesh. I hope you were able to get connected today. He's down visiting from South Africa. Great, cool. So today I'm really happy to have Jakub with us today because he actually helped test this material back at Drupal Camp Oxford last summer, and you can get him there as Hannah was saying. You can catch us on Twitter. And we're picking up actually at the point where we're looking at the information architecture, the design, the implementation. It's actually such a large topic. We focused a lot on kickoff and discovery and how important that was with Adam last week. But this is really kind of this is really the meat and bones of your project. This is everything you're doing to interpret your clients' wishes and their business needs into the actual service and site that you're creating. So we actually have a lot to cover in this session, and we can really only scratch the surface. I definitely recommend checking out Amy's chapter in the Definitive Guide to Drupal for more details about these different topics as well. So I wanted to actually introduce Jakub by asking him about his role. Now, he's actually not a project manager. He works in pre-sales, but he actually has a lot of experience in implementation. So can you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what your role is and how you work with project managers?
Sure, thanks, Heather. My name is Jacob. I'm responsible for pre-sales for Acquia for East Coast. I've been here for 2.5 years, but I've also been in a lot of projects before I joined Acquia. I was a developer, so I've seen projects from most sides, being a developer, managing projects as a project manager, managing scope and budget, but also an architect of a solution or architect of any project.
Right. So it seems like in this section or this phase of time that there's a lot of focus on the developers and the technical team. So maybe we should just look at that, really just clarifying what the roles are. Would you like to say a little bit about these various roles briefly?
Sure. Sure. There's typically probably 3 to 4 main roles in any Drupal project. One of them is site builder, and site builder, as we understand that person, is somebody who probably doesn't have a lot of coding experience, but has a lot of experience with building sites in the UI and the Drupal UI, and that's probably the biggest strength of Drupal, and that's why we use Drupal. There's also a themer, and a themer is really a specific role and separate from a developer, and that's a person that knows CSS, HTML, JavaScript. It's not necessarily a visual designer, but basically is responsible for writing CSS and HTML and all the templates into Drupal to make the site that you're building to look like the design that was created by someone. And there's also a developer, and developer is separate from site builder, because developer is somebody who is coding and who is a PHP developer and basically is responsible for writing custom code that needs to be written in some cases. We sometimes also have a new role that's an architect in bigger projects, but I don't think we need to focus on it right now.
Oh, right, okay. It is, it is interesting. I think site builders are developers, but their role is quite different. Where is the line really between, is a site builder not a developer?
I think the site builder is not responsible for writing custom codes typically, and doesn't even typically needs to know how to write custom code, and it's basically needs to make sure that he's making the right choices in the configuration. And you could basically say that site builder is really making configuration, because a lot of these tasks that a site builder is doing are actually done in the Drupal UI.
That's I think that's what makes it really interesting when we do training as well, because we see clients who they have to almost change the way they work because they have people on the team who can now do a lot more than they could before with modules such as views. They don't need to be able to write code to write a query. So it's quite different. How about the developers then? What are they, I suppose, what are they doing during this implementation time?
Sure, and developer is really somebody who's writing custom code, and we're probably all project managers here, so we can say that. So as a project manager, you're probably fighting developer ignorance very often. Basically, a developer is someone who really wants to write custom code, and you as a developer needs to manage the developers. You as a project manager need to manage the developers to make sure that actually the amount of custom code on your site is as minimal as possible.
Right. And how about the themers then? I mean, as project managers, how are we working with the themers?
So we need to interact with the themers to give them all the design files, to give them ideas about how the site is going to look like from our designers. And the themer is someone who needs to basically work with Drupal to override what's being output and write CSS. But themer is also very often somebody who actually wants to write their own HTML. And that's, again, something that you need to manage because Drupal outputs its own HTML, and you have full control of it, but sometimes you don't want to just, override everything that's being there.
Okay, cool. I think we're gonna see more of that in a little while. So then we can sort of look at, what really does the project manager do all day? I mean, what with the project managers you work with, what are their main? I guess I have some notes here. Actually, we were talking earlier, but what are their main roles in this job?
So obviously, as a project manager, and that's not specific to Drupal, your single main task is to keep budget and your timeline under control. You're taking care of the scope, and you are basically responsible for the scope and almost nothing else. But at the same time, in Drupal projects, you really need to be able to oversee the choices that your development team makes, because your task is to manage scope, but should also be to manage scope over long term, because whatever you create needs to be also maintained in longer term by probably a different team than yours, and they will probably hate you if you create something that's 50,000 lines of custom code gorilla. And the other thing that I've seen recently is you need to balance the trade-off between using software as a service tools versus core versus Drupal contributed modules versus custom code. And we've seen, I would recommend to always use Drupal for what is best. And if you just start writing code for every piece of functionality or just integrate in custom solutions or some other solutions, it's not going to be Drupal anymore. And then your maintainability is going to suffer, which means that I very often recommend people, if they need some functionality that's not right in Drupal and could not be the right fit for Drupal, try to look into software as a service solution.
Right.
So
which type of example would you give to a client?
Very easy example that's actually a normal choice for everyone would be analytics. There's a lot of competent CMS solutions that give you analytics, but Drupal is not an analytics solution. So just use Google Analytics or Omniture or any of these. Versus, I think it's a good choice, but at the same time, normal software Pivot is an analytics solution that you would have to install and then maintain over time.
Oh, okay, that makes a lot of sense. I know that we run into a lot of problems when people are keeping so much site statistics within Drupal. I wanted to ask you about this for the benefit of folks who can't make it to your New York City meetup that you're giving, that short presentation on, the craziest Drupal mistakes we've seen on our own PS team. Could you give some examples of some crazy decisions that developer teams have made, maybe some things we might be looking out for?
Sure. I've really basically sent an email to our technical team in Acquia asking them, what's your experience of the craziest things you have seen in Drupal sites, and I got over 30 responses. The three that I would call out was our customer hired a partner to create a Drupal site, but the partner didn't really know Drupal, but they thought they were going to cheat it, and they basically wrote an entire application in Zen framework, and they embedded it through JavaScript in a content item in Drupal. The other example equally bad, but in a different sense, is they wrote the entire application in PHP code in a single node using embedded PHP. And the last example would be, developers said we are turning off the CSS aggregation because it doesn't work. and they just turned it off in production instead of trying to focus on what's the real problem, why it doesn't work.
Oh, okay, I like that. I mean, I think that, my next question was going to be what are the patterns and things to watch out for. In the first two examples, it's clear that you have some really talented developers who know PHP inside out, obviously. They can probably quickly create an application, and it sounds like they just literally placed it into a content node in Drupal as opposed to working within the system. And in the second example, I mean, I know that there were so many different responses. What other sorts of patterns did you find?
I think, you said that developer team that doesn't know Drupal is definitely one. The other is coding your way out of a problem. So basically, instead of thinking of a problem in Drupal terms and trying to find the best way to do that, you just code it, which means you're creating a lot of custom code that will have to be maintained. We definitely see that quite a lot. And non-related to Drupal, really, is feature creep. Feature creep is everywhere in every project, and as a project manager, you really have to keep your focus on feature creep to make sure that you can keep your scope under control.
Oh, yeah, that actually dovetails really nicely into the next question, because I think that, there is this tendency to just grab it off of Drupal.org. It's a module. It does what you need. But I see what you mean. You can definitely run into trouble. I just wanted to talk really quick for the folks watching here. We don't necessarily know for people who are attending if you have a lot of experience with Drupal or not. But we can just take a chance to think about what's available, for example, through Drupal.org. We have lots of different projects, modules, themes, and distributions. Modules are basically things that add extra functionality to Drupal. So if we ask the question, can Drupal make a calendar or a rating system, then you'd answer that question with a module. So there's a phrase we say, there's a module for that whenever you find a problem. So it can sometimes be, like you said, though, like you said, you can end up with feature creep because it just seems so easy. And just going back to this, the main point here, there's also themes, which we'll look at in a little more detail. And then there's distributions. So themes will actually take care of making your site look the right way, but distributions are actually full versions of Drupal customized with modules and themes that have functionality out of the box. So there's Drupal Commerce and a conference website, for example, a Drupal COD or COD, Conference Organizing Distribution. So I'm going back to talk about the modules. In reality, modules are simply text files. They're text files written in PHP with sometimes images or CSS and various scripts. And you can download this code from Drupal, but what we probably want to see more of is that you use the generic components rather than trying to create all-in-one modules. In fact, you may find that if you want to get event functionality, you actually have to install 4 or 5 modules. You need views, you need the calendar module, you need the date field, and the next thing you've got 4 or 5 modules to get event functionality. And maybe you thought, I should be able to get this one module. But in fact, you're able then to reuse those same tools again and again so that, instead of creating a specialized module for member profiles or for some other type of, staff listing, you can use the same tools, the views and fields, et cetera, that make building with Drupal so much easier. And
I think
I
think this is what we've seen a lot when we talk to people that want to choose Drupal, for example. They ask, is there a catalog module in Drupal? And the answer really is no, there's no catalog module because you can build all of this using basically fields and views that you will probably talk about later.
Right. That's bringing up one of those patterns. I mean, you probably start to see, if we look through the list of problems people had and the applications that they were bunging into, a content node, they were trying to build all-in-one applications, like you said, without using the system right. So each one of those modules, every time you add another module, it is a performance cost. It literally is consuming your memory on your site if you have a module enabled. So you do have to make sure to just uninstall and delete any unused modules. I think we've seen that so many times, and we'll talk about it at the next week with Amy. We're going to talk about launch, but it's such a common thing where you have a production site ready to go, and there's like 20 modules that were used during and tested during development still in there. So there's still data there from the modules, and they're still eating up memory, and they're not needed. So I wanted to ask you, from your perspective, when do we need to customize, and what are the limitations, of core and contribute modules? When do you sort of see this happening?
So sometimes you need to customize Drupal, and by customize Drupal, we really mean use some of the Drupal APIs that we will talk about later when you have a need to alter some of the functionality. As an example, some module will be giving you some specific permissions to access a page, but you need to change the permissions, or some module will enable you to create a block, but you need to have a different title of the block. So that's all things that you could do using APIs. And the good news is, because of the way how Drupal is done, you do all of that through Drupal APIs. And those are basically extensible hooks that allow you to change what is happening without actually changing the code you already downloaded, which again speaks to the maintenance later on.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes you can also look on Drupal.org into issue queues, and issue queues basically are really lists of issues that are done against any module or any country or core. And very often, if you need some specific functionality, there's going to be an existing issue with some kind of patch that will be added to the issue. And I think that's a good segue to talk about what really is a patch, because as a project manager, you will sit in a meeting with developers, and they will say, I applied this patch and it worked. I applied this patch and it didn't work. So really knowing what a patch is very good. And really, patch is a record of changes. Because the modules are really text files, they're basically really a file full of text in some specific format. Patch is a record of changes in this text file. And there's typically lines that start with a minus and lines that start with a plus. And minus removes a line, plus adds a line. So it's quite easy to actually interpret it even manually if the patch is quite short.
Definitely. And I suppose patch management and change, customization management is something that developers are always in charge of. But I suppose it's really good for project managers to understand it. So what are the risks then when, I suppose we've touched on it a little bit, and we sort of see this whole danger area of writing custom code. What did you want to add to that in terms of what we should be watching out for when we're writing custom code?
I think not rewrite parts of Drupal. We've seen that in past when people just took Drupal and ripped out half of Drupal and wrote their own engine. And when you ask them, they just say speed, for example. So that's a bad thing. Hacking core or contributed modules, and by hacking really means changing them. So downloading a contributed module and just without using any APIs, changing that to make sure your module does what you need it to do. And you can always use some tools to do that, like Akka Insight is a tool we have that can give you a score for your configuration, but also check if your site has been tagged in terms of modified core or contributed modules.
I'm sorry I don't have a chance to open up the demo or show the screenshot from Insight. I'm really sorry about that, but I can add it into the blog post. You'll see at the end of the session. So I think this is good. At this point, we're sort of like digging into a little bit more of implementation to understand what our colleagues are doing during this time. And so I'm just going to run through some various aspects of theming and sort of how we interpret designs and business ideas in the implementation. Themes, you can see this website here, for example. We show like 4 different themes. It's the same content, same configuration, and you can actually see how the theme chooses or changes the way it looks. And really, that's the type of theme you want to be building. You want to build something that drapes over the configuration. And really bad themes are ones which have a lot of site-specific content right in the template layer or site-specific configuration, so that if you actually change the theme, major parts of the site would be broken. So you really want to think of it as draping or overriding what's there. This, for example, is a theme. It's just like the module in the sense that it's template files, PHP files or CSS files, and again, just plain old text files. And they can actually be managed through version control, but this sort of schematic, just to give you an idea, is that the configuration, which is all happening on the right side, which is your Drupal core and contributed module files, they control all of the business logic, and the theme layer just controls how something will actually look. So it's really the job of the themers, who's working with CSS and JavaScript to actually kind of put the final touches on how it looks. But they usually have to go back in and configure and change some output. So they'll have to understand how views works, or they'll have to understand how to work with content types. There's various kinds of themes. We have contributed themes, and the contributed themes also includes base themes as well. I wanted to pull out base themes and specify that many contributed themes rely on a base theme, and it's usually best practice. If you don't use your own base theme, you probably want to use one of the great well-tested contributed base themes to build off of your own. Just so much work's gone into controlling how Drupal outputs content, and I think that it's a great start. For example, Zen's a really good start for a responsive theme. There's also commercial themes that you can buy that just work off the shelf. They usually need some configuration to work quite right, but you can see some examples of custom themes at Drupal Showcase. So I wonder if you could talk to us, Jakob, we just go back into that the idea of like what makes Drupal different, and maybe you could talk to us about content modeling with Drupal.
Sure, and I think if you really need to remember one thing from this webinar, it should be this, because this is very important for Drupal projects and going forward as well. What's very important is, our mind works almost like in folders. We folder papers, we folder files on our laptop, and that's the same way where you might be thinking about a CMS and content there. Really taking, let's say, news and adding sports news, politics news into a website. But what it really is what this really means is structure, right? Because you're basically building a structure of a website before you define the content of the website. And that's when you have typical single pages on a website, and that's probably fine on single pages of the website. But what we've seen increasingly, especially if you're in media, entertainment, and these other sectors, you're not really enabling pages, you're basically creating content, right? And what Drupal really is structure, content first, or data first, right? Instead of writing pages or writing structure and then content into it, you're writing content. And that content could be an article, it could be a user, or it could be a term like taxonomy term to categorize something, or a comment. And you're focusing on something that we call structured content. You can imagine unstructured content as really something that has a title. So let's talk about recipes. Recipe for meatloaf has a title, meatloaf, and then it has ingredients, then it has the recipe itself, how to actually make something. And you could write it in an unstructured way in a blog post or wiki into a body of some text and just write the ingredients. But that's not the best way to do that, and that's not how Drupal approaches the problem. Drupal really approaches it as a structured field. So you would have a field for a title, you would have a field for image upload, you would have a field or set of fields for ingredients, and then maybe you will have a field, there will be a text for actual instructions for a recipe. And what this allows you to do is focus, first of all, have your content editors on focusing on the content itself and not how the content is going to look like, but also define different ways of showing the content. So imagine on the next slide that you want to show the two most recent recipes with an image as a square thumbnail and body with up to 100 words. You can pick these fields and display this on your website. And in the second example, you want to really display like a Pinterest-like gallery of images. So you can, again, do that because you have a structured image field, and unstructured content wouldn't allow you to do that. And it's even more important right now because we're talking about desktop sites, we're talking about mobile sites and responsive sites. And I assume that in the next 9 months it's going to be something like an iWatch or something like that from Apple, and it's not going to be mobile anymore. It's going to be like a watch, and you will need to display content in a watch. And that's important because then you will be able to pick out parts of your structured content and display differently on different devices.
Definitely. Excellent. I mean, I was just reminded, and I'll add that to the notes, but there was a great talk by Karen McGrain at DrupalCon just recently, and it was really all about this, what makes Drupal so different is kind of puts us in a great position for being able to catch that wave. How about in terms of, we looked at some of those, how we take that content and put into layout. I thought it'd be good now if we talk about how we control layout with Drupal.
Sure. So there's a couple of things you need to know about layout in Drupal, and your developers will talk about that, so you need to understand that. The layout of a page really depends on what your conditions of the layout, what the conditions of the layout are, and what the reactions are, and it's usually defined mainly by the URL. So it could be example.com/article/meatloaf, and also whether this is a logged-in user or anonymous user. And in Drupal, we define something that's called regions. And regions are basically parts of the page that have some specific, things in them. And region could be a header, for example. It could be a main content or a sidebar. And you can define your regions in Drupal as you wish. And you can see that basically these regions are really in a layout. And when you talk about responsive sites, then when your view of the site is really narrow, then it allows you to reposition these regions as you wish.
Right.
We also have something that's called blocks. And blocks are really parts of content, but they are not usually structured content. They're really either defined automatically by some automated tool in Drupal or really unstructured content. And blocks are basically placed into any regions. And you can configure blocks. You can output them by modules. So, for example, the user login that's shown here. Or you can output them by some important modules like views. Views is probably one of the most important modules in Drupal that really changed how people build sites. And it's important to know views because views allows you to take the structured content you've created and created really views of the content. So you could say, I want my top 10 recipes and give me just the title of the recipe, and you can click in the configuration how you want this to look like and what you really want based on some conditions and arguments, and sort them and then display them in blocks and put those into regions.
Cool. Oh.
We also have something that's called view modes, and view modes are really typically focused on content items themselves, and you can imagine them as, for example, teaser or a full page. Teaser could be in the listing of a content, while full page is really showing the whole content on a single page. So just to do a quick recap, we have pages. Pages typically have regions, and they contain blocks. Blocks are not structured content typically. They're usually output by modules or created manually. And the output is typically done by either some custom or contributed modules or by views module.
Excellent, cool. And, this is, I'm just kind of sitting here thinking, we had a hard time really deciding where to draw the line in terms of talking about Drupal implementation and talking about layout. There's just so many solutions, panels or context, display suite, and there's a lot of ways that you can kind of overcome some of the core limitations. But just for the sake of making sure we get enough time for asking questions, I think we're going to have to leave that there. And if people have specific questions about implementation, we can pick them up. I think that through this whole process, what's interesting is, the project manager isn't expected to know how to use views, or they're not expected to actually be building the sites. So, how does a project manager really maintain quality and ensure that, the site does what it's supposed to do and works the way it, the client intended and we told the client it would?
Sure. I think we have a specific session I think in 2 weeks or in 3 weeks about quality assurance that will be very focused on this.
Oh, cool.
But just from the high level, you need to first be able to test functionality, and you can do that using a couple of things. First of all, there's something that's called Selenium, and Selenium is a testing tool that it's basically testing in browser. What that means is you can click in a browser and record these actions and expect some event to happen. And you can then run this automatically. You can also use a tool called Simple Test that's really for in-code testing, functional testing. Or you can use some software as a service, as I said, tools like UTest. And utest.com is crowdsourced testing that allows you to define a test and then say, I want 5 people to test this every week on this URL. And they will run this test for you with those people.
All right. So with Selenium, for example, you said you record steps, and those steps then can be played back. Is that actually something a project manager would get involved in actually creating the tests, on smaller teams?
I think you could potentially do that as a project manager. It depends how big your team is. You would typically have a specific QA team that would be responsible for that. Sometimes you would ask your developers to basically write these tests, but as a project manager, you can definitely get involved as well. Since this tool really is very easy to use, just in a browser, you record these actions. And you can obviously output those into code and run them automatically, but you can also do that in a browser.
Right, and we did talk a little bit, in terms of like working in agile methods and maybe something that's sort of like a modified agile method in real life. But what about test-driven development? Is that something that, from the beginning that a project manager would be able to write the spec in such a way that it can be tested later? Or is that something a developer's doing? Sorry.
Yeah, I think that, again, it depends on your size of a team. If you have a big team, it's usually the business analyst that should be responsible for writing really tests as part of the spec. But in small teams, you could be the project manager, for example, because you as a project manager are really working with the client to define the spec. And there's tools to do that. I think it's called BHAT right now, Behavioral Driven Development and Testing. And there's tools like Cucumber or Capybara. I don't know who comes up with these names, but it's nice to remember. And these allow you to really define your functionality as a test in English language. So you could write, as a user X, I can go to page /login, log in there as username Jacob and password Jacob, and then click on a page X and expect a result that's specified like this. So you write it in English, and then there's tools that allow you to interpret this into an actual test.
Oh, that's really brilliant. So this is definitely something that, as like you were saying, there's someone on the team, possibly a business analyst, could be the project manager on smaller projects, who's actually writing the tests as part of the specification, and that's directly something that you'd be able to say from the beginning of the project, this is what we said it was going to do, and at the end, you should be able to test and say, yeah, the site does this and that. And that's sort of where the UTest tool comes in as well, because you actually ask these people. It's recordings, I think, which is interesting. You get to see and hear what the people are experiencing. Is that right?
That's right.
Cool. So I guess there's another aspect to testing as well, which is testing quality. And I kind of wondered, what's the difference, I suppose, between the functionality and quality?
So functionality is really driven by your functional specification. So, I need to be able to click on a button and get a page X, but it doesn't really say how good the solution is in the background. And your quality really affects your maintenance going forward, how expensive it is going to be for you or your clients to maintain such a solution, but also how expensive is it going to be to make changes, because if you create a solution that's done very badly and 6 months later people ask you to make changes, it will be very difficult to make them.
Okay, all right. Well, I'm kind of curious then how we actually do test quality when we, we're not developers. We can't look at the code and see how it was written.
Sure. So I think that first and foremost, drive your developers to avoid custom code as much as possible. because that will make sure that, you're not the only person in the world using some piece of code, which means there's going to be more eyes looking at it. And what I think is extremely important to look for as a project manager, as a developer, is on documentation. And I've seen a lot of documentation that focuses on how is some specific solution architected and what it does. But I think that the more important thing on documentation is why it has been done in this way. Because it's not extremely easy, but it's quite easy for a developer to look into code or some solution and find out how it really works. But it's extremely hard to go back and say, this is why it works in this way, because that's based on some thinking of a different person, and you don't know what that person thought. And even if it's you who created the solution, you will never remember that 6 months later. So documenting why is extremely important.
Right. Can you sort of give us an example? I can think of a few examples myself where I've opened up client sites and kind of my eyes bug out of my head, like, why did someone do it this way? And then usually you find out someone was trying to get it done quickly, but can you give an example of something specific if it comes to mind?
Sure. So I've just been involved in a project where the customer has chosen some specific database to run the site, and this was unrelated to Drupal, so they have chosen MongoDB instead of MySQL database. And that's a choice that they are entitled to make. But 6 months later, people ask, so why did you exactly do MongoDB? Because nobody knew. And turns out they find out that there's 100 million pieces of content on a specific site, and they thought it will be hard for MySQL to scale at this amount of content. So it's, if you just document, we have chosen MongoDB, it's fine, but nobody knows why. And so you need to document, we have chosen MongoDB because there's going to be 100 million pieces of content on the site.
Right.
That's the most important piece of information.
And so then you don't have to go through and sort of trudge all over that territory again and debate these questions over and over again. That makes a lot of sense.
Exactly, because as a project manager, you're fighting your client for scope and budget, but you're also fighting your developers because every developer has their own hat, and they will think that whatever solution has been created in past is wrong, and they need to start from scratch to rewrite it in their own terms. So you need to document why, so you can tell them, no, we are not rewriting from scratch because of this reason.
It sounds like a battle between two different odds in a way. You mentioned Acquia Insight before, and I'm sorry I didn't actually queue up a demo of Insight actually for this, and there is definitely, I can link to it from the blog post, but what about PS, or is there something you want to add about Insight, even though we mentioned it before? What about PS and the site audits? What do you guys actually do in those?
We focus, in Acquia, we really focus on making sure that the projects are successful. So in Insight, you can check the configuration of the site for some best practices, but we're also doing some new things that you can probably write a link to in the blog post about source code analysis, so you can actually analyze the source code for some patterns for cross-site scripting, SQL injection for security. But we also have a professional services team that's like we call them a SWAT team. They basically come into a client, do a site audit, write a report, and go back, or they come in, do an architecture workshop to make sure architecture choices are the right choices, and then go back as well. So that's one option you can choose. All
right. Yeah, I was interested to know, there's sort of limitations to what Acquia's Insight tool. I know there's a lot of things they can't automate. Can you sort of give an example of something that you'd only discover in a site audit versus it not being available in, or not discoverable, I should say, in Acquia Insight?
Acquia Insight is really static analysis based on some best practices and also some patterns in code, while professional services are people. So they're consultants that can actually look into the site, for example, load test the site and watch the site how it behaves. So that's something you typically cannot do using a static code analysis.
Right, okay, cool. I know that people in the PS team are working really hard on seeing ways that they can automate some of these tools so that we can sort of amplify that knowledge that's sort of locked in the PS team. So we're wrapping up now. People can probably start asking questions if you have some things in mind. I'd like for folks who are going to be following on with us for next week to think of actually taking it as an assignment, but think of a content type for an example project. And if you've never designed or planned a content type before, take a chance to think about how you would do that. There was actually a great webinar recently about site building best practices. There's a lot of information online about creating content types in Drupal, and I've linked to a bunch in this blog post here. It would be excellent if you just sort of think about it, come back and ask questions about how you've approached actually structuring a content type. And if you've never searched for a module before, I've put in an assessment checklist in that link below, and you can go through and do a search yourself if you've never done it before, of choosing and selecting a module and maybe seeing sort of the process that your developer or site building team goes through. So does anyone have any questions? Hannah?
Yep, we had a couple questions come in. The first question is, can you please recommend the book that details the Drupal project management process?
Yes, actually, there's one specific book by Danny Norden on Drupal for project managers, and then there is, and I'll make sure to put that in that blog post if I haven't already. And the other one is actually a chapter by Amy Skvarda, who's actually coming next week to talk about launching, and she's truly a project manager, and she's actually been involved in the community, kind of helping to share best practices for project managers. And that's a chapter in the Definitive Guide to Drupal 7. And so the Definitive Guide to Drupal 7, I definitely have linked there, and I'll make sure to link to Danny Norden's book.
Awesome, thanks so much. We also had a question if you could provide links to the tools that you were referring to before.
Excellent, I will do that. And I think there were a number that we mentioned. I will do that.
Awesome, thanks so much. If anybody has any additional questions, please ask them in the Q&A tab now.
Cool. And there's also, you can contact us if you want to talk about training, and of course the next 2 sessions are available to sign up for now on the webinars page too.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Heather, and thanks so much, Jacob. Again, slides and recording of the webinar will be posted to the Acquia.com website in the next 48 hours, and we'll also email you out a copy. Thanks so much.
Thanks a lot.
Bye. Bye, guys.